Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a wildly fascinating intersection. We are looking at where the hard biological wiring of our brains actually collides with the high-minded philosophy of how we figure out what's true. We're talking all about human bias. Specifically, we'll explore how our own biology constantly wrestles with scientific truth and why achieving true objectivity is, well, a whole lot harder than we usually think. So, have you ever dealt with someone, maybe it's a really respected boss, a senior academic, or just an industry expert, who defensively clings to an argument that has clearly been proven wrong? It's kind of a universal experience, right? You show them the hard data, and instead of just saying, okay, I see, they completely double down. It really makes us wonder, why do incredibly intelligent people suddenly act so irrationally when their ideas are challenged?
All right, Section 1, the myth of expertise and cognitive bias.
We tend to have this idea that with enough degrees or years of experience, a person magically becomes a perfectly rational thinking machine. But science tells a very different story. The truth is, the human brain is not a perfect objective computer. As cognitive psychologists point out, it's actually an efficiency machine. It has to process millions of bits of information every single second, and to just survive, it has to take mental shortcuts. Now, those shortcuts are great for quick, everyday decisions, but they can lead to massive errors in judgment, regardless of how many PhDs you happen to have hanging on your wall. Okay, let's dive into this a bit deeper. The psychological root of these mental shortcuts is what we call cognitive bias. Basically, it's the systematic tendency of our brains to process information irrationally. It's not a glitch at all. It's literally a built-in energy-saving feature. But here's the catch. In our complex modern world, this very mechanism severely compromises our ability to evaluate new data fairly. And a really huge pervasive part of this is confirmation bias. This specific bias makes all of us, and yes, that absolutely includes highly experienced experts, unconsciously favor data that supports the theories we already hold. We actively hunt for information that says, hey, you're right, while just completely ignoring or dismissing any contradictory evidence. For senior professionals, this bias essentially acts as an invisible shield to protect their reputation, their prestige, and their professional identity. Moving into Section 2, why exactly does the brain absolutely hate criticism? Now, what's really interesting about this is the biological contrast. When we're calm, our prefrontal cortex, the logical, rational part of the brain, is totally in charge. But when we get criticized, especially in a public or professional setting, neuroscience shows something crazy. The brain actually misinterprets an intellectual critique as a literal physical threat. Believe it or not, your brain doesn't really differentiate between a wild predator attacking you and a colleague pointing out an error in your spreadsheet during a meeting. The very second your idea is challenged, your sympathetic nervous system kicks straight into fight or flight mode. You get this sudden flood of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. And meanwhile, that logical prefrontal cortex we just talked about, it temporarily shuts down. This biological hijacking perfectly explains why professional disagreements so often devolve into heated emotional conflicts. In that moment, our biology is focused entirely on survival, not on finding scientific truth. So knowing this biological reality is absolutely crucial. This defensive reaction is just a natural survival mechanism. But the main takeaway here is that true professionals and true scientists really must practice emotional control. We have to actively develop the reflective thinking skills to just pause, take a breath, let that cortisol subside, and evaluate the information objectively rather than just blindly reacting to a perceived threat. All right, Section 3, falsification and self-correcting science. Because look, if our brains are biologically hardwired to be this defensive, how do we ever actually figure out the truth? Well, the foundation of human knowledge isn't based on experts being perfectly flawless. True science is actually built entirely on an openness to revision and correction. The scientific system itself is what corrects for our individual biological flaws. So, the crucial point here from the philosophy of science is this concept from Karl Popper, falsification. Basically, it's the idea that for any theory to be genuinely scientific, it has to be open to being tested and potentially proven wrong. Actively trying to prove our own theories wrong is the actual engine of scientific progress. If a theory survives rigorous attempts to break it, it just becomes stronger. Let's see how this builds in the real world. Take atomic theory. Back in 1808, John Dalton proposed his early model of the atom. It was completely groundbreaking at the time, but it wasn't the final truth. Throughout the 20th century, it faced continuous revisions, which eventually led to the wildly complex quantum mechanics we use today. Dalton wasn't a failure because his model was revised. His model was a necessary stepping stone. This proves that in science, revision is progress. It is definitely not failure. And honestly, the beauty of the scientific method is that it recognizes that truth is tentative. Even historical geniuses, the people we revere as the smartest minds in history, like Albert Einstein, regularly revise their views based on new findings. Einstein didn't let his ego stop him from accepting new physics. Admitting mistakes isn't a sign of intellectual weakness. It's a clear indicator of scientific maturity. It's practically a superpower in a world that is so often blinded by ego. Which brings us to our final part, Section 4. Building intellectual humility. So how do we take all these psychological and philosophical realities and actually apply them? Well, the ultimate cure for our biological biases is intellectual humility. It's simply the profound awareness that every single human being, regardless of their fancy title or tenure, has limits to their knowledge and is absolutely capable of making mistakes. Intellectual humility stands in direct contrast to a fragile ego and the false armor of seniority. It's really about separating your own self-worth from your hypotheses. To truly innovate, our organizations and academic institutions need a massive cultural shift. We have to completely move away from the old culture, the one that's super hierarchical, based on social status, highly defensive, and, frankly, terrified of criticism. Instead, we have to embrace a healthy culture. This is an environment based entirely on empirical data, where true collaboration thrives, and everyone is genuinely open to revision. In a healthy culture, the data wins, not just the highest paid person in the room. And this has massive implications, especially for the younger generations stepping into these spaces. You should absolutely feel empowered to speak up and think critically. It is perfectly fine to disagree with authority. The key is just to make sure you're doing it constructively, with solid data, sharp logic, and highly respectful communication. We need to evaluate opinions based on the strength of the evidence provided, not on the job title of the person who's speaking. So, what does this all mean for us today? Well, it leaves us with one final, perhaps slightly uncomfortable question. Are you ready to admit you're wrong today? Because the moment you reframe being wrong, not as a personal attack or some biological threat, but as the ultimate necessary step toward true learning, you unlock a completely new level of growth. Embracing your mistakes might just be the smartest thing you ever do. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those great questions, and I'll catch you next time.